Hello and welcome back. I am Mr. Sosotris, and this week we are continuing with Beowulf. This week we're looking at the first adventure in this epic poem, focusing on Beowulf's battle with Grendel. So let's get into it. All right, so let's start with a story overview of what happens in this first section. So, Hrothgar, king of the Danes and heir to an impressive legacy, builds a massive mead hall bedecked with gold, and the loud feasting of the people within it awaken Grendel, a monstrous figure, who lays siege to the mead hall for 12 years. And he kills and devours the men inside kind of whenever he wants it. It's just awful. And so word gets out that the situation is pretty bad with these folks. And a hero of the Geats, who's another tribe, his name's Beowulf, he comes in to sort of fix the issue. And he's noble looking and he's strong, and Hrothgar accepts him and his men. And so they kind of hold up in the mead hall, which is called Heorot, or Heorot. And Grendel arrives the next day looking for a meal, and Beowulf fights him, and he does it without any armor. He tears Grendel's arm off, and Grendel flees and then eventually dies. And so Hrothgar honors Beowulf with a sword, a helmet, a mail shirt, and a war banner, and everyone rejoices. And things seem okay for the time being. So, this feels like a pretty simple, straightforward poem. This is definitely one where there's not a lot of extraneous fluff. Everything in it serves the story, and I think that's why Beowulf is one of my favorites, is because it's one of those ones where, regardless of the translation, it has this propulsive energy that just pulls you right in, and you're off to the races. It's fantastic. So let's talk about some of the major players here. Let's talk about Beowulf first. What kind of guy is Beowulf? So his name, as I talked about last week, his name means Beowulf, which is a clever way of saying bear, or like honey devourer. And I should specify here, Beowulf is not an actual bear. He is not like a walking, talking bear who wears armor. That's not a thing. There were some older translations who translate Beowulf as like an actual bear. And no, he is a person. He is a human person. He is not a bear, but his name means bear. He doesn't have any sort of supernatural abilities, but the way he's described, he almost seems supernaturally strong and has sort of unending stamina and endurance and everything. But the way we need to look at him is he's not magical in and of himself, the way we would think of someone like Heracles, who gets his strength from being a son of Zeus, so he's like half god. He's more like the biblical character of Samson, who is sort of also supernaturally strong, but he gets his strength from sort of a pact that he makes with God, not because of kind of who he is. And there is sort of suggestions through this that Beowulf, sorry, the cat's playing with the toy. Beowulf gets his strength and his like endurance and stamina and everything from his faith in God. So that could be part of it. But anytime you have sort of these ancient stories, epic poems, epic sagas, anything like that, you'll have lots of instances of sort of supposedly regular human characters who aren't half god and anything like that, but who still, are able to do, outrageous, incredible things. So we just have to kind of accept it. There's a heightened reality in epic poetry that makes sort of everyday things exaggerated, and so you always have to kind of be aware of sort of what's the difference between does this person have superhuman abilities, or are they just meant to be heroic, and heroic people can do all kinds of crazy things? So be aware of that. I also want to have a little sidebar here, and I want to answer the question, does Beowulf fight Grendel naked? So because the Robert Zemeckis film version from I think 2007, in that one, Beowulf fights Grendel in the buff. And the animators sort of cheap out on us there, because they could have just had him just fighting in his underwear and that would have been fine, but they chose to sort of like have strategic shadows everywhere, so it's like, we're gonna have Beowulf naked, but we're not actually gonna ever see him naked, which is disappointing, but that's fine. So in the poem, it all depends on how the translator wants to present things. So the translation I'm reading right now, which is Maria Dovana Headley's translation, which is fantastic. I love this book so much. In her translation, she just has him take off his armor and his sword, like his mail shirt and his sword, before he goes to bed. So they all sleep kind of communally in Harrod, and then when Grendel shows up the next day, he doesn't have time to put on an armor or to pick up a sword. And so the great deed that he does is that he fights Grendel sort of without protection and without weapons. And there are some translations that go kind of a step further and say that, like, when he got ready for bed, he just stripped completely. And so when everyone wakes up, when Grendel attacks, everyone's just like not wearing anything, and Beowulf fights Grendel just in the buff with nothing. So that's, I mean, if you want to go there, you can, but I think it's much more likely that he was probably just wearing whatever he wore to sleep, which is probably like, I don't know, a tunic, which is like a really long shirt kind of thing, or whatever he would have worn sort of under his armor or under his clothes. So he does undress to go to sleep, and then when Grendel attacks, he fights in whatever he was wearing, but he doesn't necessarily have to have been fighting Grendel completely naked. So he wasn't protected. So it's still impressive. It's still very cool that he fights Grendel with his bare hands and he tears off his arm without using any kind of weaponry or anything. But he doesn't necessarily have to have been fighting Grendel completely naked. So I'm sorry to disappoint you, but that's probably not what happened. All right, moving on. We also see, so talking about Beowulf, we see that he's kind of described as a noble person. There's a scene when he first arrives, and the people who see him say that he's dressed well, and he has like a strong bearing, and so he must be sort of a noble person. So they sort of allow him into Harrod, and instead of shooing him away, saying like, you're just some rabble. Because if just a group of armed people had showed up at this mead hall and they didn't look sort of put together in some way, or they didn't look kind of noble, they would have been assumed that they were maybe opportunists who had heard that their fighting forces were weakened because of Grendel, and so they wanted to maybe try attacking the mead hall. And so the fact that he looks noble is the reason why they let him in the first place. And hello. And so we also have the moment when Unferth taunts him. And so that's after they've been welcomed in. And there's like this jealous drunk guy named Unferth. And he's trying to sort of pull Beowulf down a peg. And so he talks about a story that he heard of where Beowulf was in a swimming contest with this guy named Brecca. And he didn't win, like he didn't finish the race. And so Brecca finished the race, and Beowulf, it took him like 7 days to get to the end. And so he uses that to kind of insult him and say, you think you're some great hero, but what the heck happened here? And Beowulf's response is so great. He well actuallys him, and he's like, oh yeah, I didn't finish that race because I single-handedly fought and killed a giant sea monster that was living under the water and was threatening the other swimmer and also all the ships that kind of went through. So the reason why he didn't finish the race is because he was doing something even bigger and cooler than beating kind of a buddy in a swimming race. He was destroying this massive sea monster, which he kills with his bare hands in the ocean. And Unferth kind of shuts up after that. So we see what kind of person he is. He's someone who he goes for kind of the biggest glory. He's always doing heroic things, and he's always thinking about sort of how he can make things better for everyone else around him. So he's described as sort of a noble, heroic person. And in this poem, the concept of heroism, it isn't something that's like just attached to someone forever. If you think of like a superhero, if you think of someone like Spider-Man, okay, there's, you know, he has ups and downs, but there's this sense that he's like a heroic person and everyone expects him to be a heroic person kind of all the time. And if that doesn't happen, then they're sort of disappointed, but he can kind of win their trust back by, you know, proving that he's always kind of been heroic. In this, being a hero is very much a temporary, fleeting thing. And you always have to be constantly fighting to prove that you're a hero kind of all the time. And so if you don't do enough heroic stuff constantly, people will just be like, oh, well, he's not a hero anymore. And, you know, he's past his prime and he's not worth talking about. And so it's all about sort of keeping the glory, like keeping the spotlight on yourself at all times. And so we've got Beowulf, who is kind of constantly having to prove that he's a heroic person. And we also see this in Hrothgar too. The question of sort of, is he a good king, is sort of hovering around the whole poem. Remember at the very beginning, I read a section of the beginning of the poem last time, and it talks about shield chiefing, and he is described as a good king, and he was heroic, and he was noble, and that question of, or that statement of he was a good king sort of hovers throughout the whole poem, and we're constantly asking that question of ourselves, first of Hrothgar and then later of Beowulf. And so when you ask yourself, you know, is Hrothgar a good king? Some people would say, oh, well, he's done good things, so he's kind of a good king, and, you know, we're happy with that. But there's the sense that Hrothgar has to sort of constantly, like, it's like he has to constantly take a test to get the certification that says, yes, I'm a good king. And if he has to constantly prove that all the time. So when he built Heorot, I think it's Heorot, when he built it, that was sort of a good thing because it was this huge mead hall. And this isn't just like, if you think of like Meduseld from the Lord of the Rings movies, that's where King Theoden lives. That's a mead hall also. But it's sort of described as like, it's big, but it's not like massive and impressive. It's sort of a fading, it's like a relic of a fading kingdom. And so this is way bigger than that. This huge, massive structure. It's described as like, you know, it could be like one of the 7 wonders of the world. It's the 8th wonder of the world kind of thing. So it's massive, and it's got gold plating, and it's very, very impressive. So building that was sort of a good thing. We also see that Hrothgar is very generous to people. He's, you know, he understands hospitality rules, and so he welcomes Beowulf's people in. And afterwards, even though Beowulf is really the only one who does anything, he rewards Beowulf, but he also rewards the men that he brought with him, and he pays sort of the weregild, the blood price for the man who's killed at the beginning. So we understand that Hrothgar sort of respects the cultural conventions of sort of what it means to be a good king. But then there's also the question of, you know, he's unable to protect his people for 12 years. And so Grendel is attacking them and killing people and stealing things for 12 years, and Hrothgar and his people can't do anything about it. So there's probably a question, like his popularity was probably a bit shaky by that point because he sort of failed to protect the people under his protection. And Beowulf is sort of an outsider. He comes from a different tribe completely. The Geats were probably like in Sweden somewhere, and the Danes are of course in Denmark. So, you know, he's like an outside influence has to come in and sort of save them. And so there's always this kind of question is Hrothgar a good king? And does he continue to be a good king? And you kind of have to ask yourself that. There's also the question of Beowulf, but we'll get to that in part 3, because that's when he becomes king. And the question of is he a good king kind of comes up again. So keep that kind of in the back of your minds. So, okay, moving on. Let's talk about Grendel next, because Grendel's great. I love him so much. So first off, the question would be sort of, what is he? In the poem, he's described as a descendant of Cain. Now, okay, remember I said last time there were two scribes who wrote down Beowulf, and they both kind of had different handwriting, and they made sort of different quirks. And so the first scribe wrote it originally as Grendel was a descendant of Ham, who was sort of the disgraced son of Noah. He's disgraced because he like sees his father naked at one point, and so he's sort of cursed for it. And in the original, like text, you can see that like the other scribe sort of crossed that out and changed it to a descendant of Cain. Cain is the son of Adam and Eve. He's sort of the first murderer in biblical history. He kills his brother Abel, and then he's cursed for that as well. And so it's like two different kinds of curses. And so he's described as a descendant of Cain. So there's a chance that he has human descendants, basically. And in lots of media, he's described as sort of a monster, either like an ogre or a troll or some kind of hideous, deformed forest beast. One of my favorite depictions of Beowulf or of Grendel comes from Xena Warrior Princess. Of all things, there's the trilogy of episodes where she gets involved in the events of like the Ring saga, like Wagner's Ring cycle. And for some reason, because I guess they're in, Scandinavia, there's also Beowulf and Grendel, and that's tied into like everything else. I think Grendel ends up being like Grunhilde, who's transformed or something. Like, it's totally bizarre, and like the way they mash up the two stories is hilarious. But I love the design of Grendel. He looks so cool. He's like this forest, kind of like an evil ent. He's like this forest monster, and he looks like kind of a twisted tree beast. He's so cool. I love the design of it. It's a really great, it's like a practical puppet costume thing, and it's awesome. I love it so much. But so anyways, in media, Grendel is usually described as being like a monster of some kind, but there's a chance that he might not be, because it is kind of vague. So Grendel could also just be like a giant person, like a really tall human, something like, Goliath, maybe, if we're talking back to, biblical mythology. Or he could just be like a really strong guy, but like really wild, because he lives like by a lake or in a lake. And he's, kind of this wild guy, with like, maybe he wears skins and he's really like dirty and everything. So it could be anything. The way that Beowulf is written, there's so many like highly metaphorical kennings that are used to sort of describe everything, that it's hard to say if like Grendel is monstrous because he is a monster, or if he's monstrous because he's sort of outside the accepted realm of sort of civilization, if he's just kind of a wild person who lives off the land. And there's other kind of depictions. I know this translation doesn't really give him any supernatural monstrous qualities. He's wild, and he's really big, and he's strong, but he could just very well be just like a really beefy guy who sort of lives in the wild. I really like the idea, actually, of Grendel just being like just a regular guy, but like someone sort of who grows up in the wild and sort of lives off the land and is sort of this wild, untamed counterpart, or like not counterpart, but mirror image of Beowulf, who's sort of privileged and noble and sort of very much like in society and everything. And so you've got kind of two evenly matched heroes. One is sort of the civilized one, which, the concept of civilized is a really loaded term, and it's used to sort of justify atrocities against people that are determined to be uncivilized. So I don't really like using that word, but I think a good way to do that would be like, one who exists in society and one who doesn't need to exist in sort of that society and sort of has his own life out in the wilderness. So I don't know, I like the idea of Beowulf and Grendel being sort of two guys, but from very, very different worldviews, and there's kind of this clash between them. So it's up to you. If you want to interpret Grendel as a monster, you totally can. The text sort of supports it either way, because he's described very metaphorically, where like he's troll-ish, or he's giant, or he's monstrous, but it could just be exaggeration in the same way that Beowulf is described as being sort of supernaturally strong, even though he's not sort of divine or anything. So it's up to you. Okay, finally, let's talk about themes. So there's lots of themes in this, and I'm not going to dwell super overlong on any one of these, but definitely think about it, because a lot of them are questions that will come up throughout the poem, and you'll revisit them as you go. So the first one that's really good, and I kind of already talked about this, is the conflict of like the society of Herit and the wild, untamed energy of Grendel, who sort of lives out in the wild. And so we've got Hrothgar and Beowulf, who are very concerned with customs and tradition and the trappings of their culture. And then you've got Grendel, who sort of doesn't need any of that. He doesn't use any technology. He also doesn't respect any customs. That's part of what makes him so evil, is he has no respect, I guess, for the customs and beliefs of the Danes and the Geats. So that's something to be thinking about, and I'll circle back to that as well in a little bit. But there's also the theme of sort of, what makes a man, what makes a hero. The concept of masculinity is really interesting in this, because we get lots of different depictions, and it's not a really cut and dry depiction. I know one thing that I really like about this translation is that she really plays up the sort of like the masculinity of the characters and approaches that in kind of a modern sense. So we get the sense that these are all sort of, it's like the like frat guy culture, or like anytime you have like a team, for example, like a sports team of some kind, anytime you have like a group of men, and it's all about competition and strength and cleverness and the ways that you can sort of stand out in the crowd, because you don't want to sort of be ordinary, and everyone is always in competition with one another. And so the concept of sort of what is masculinity is really interesting in this, because it doesn't really come up with an answer for it. A lot of times we see different things that people do that are said to be noble or said to be good, but there's no sort of one perfect answer. Even Beowulf, he's a hero, and in this first section he does some really cool things, but as the poem gets on, we start to see him more as a flawed, complicated person, and he's not necessarily this paragon of any kind. It's sort of, in the moment, in this first section, when he's fighting Grendel, that's sort of the height of his heroism in this section. And so in that moment, he's a hero, but can he hold on to that title of a hero as the story goes? And we'll answer that as we go on. So that's really cool, and I really like that. Also, the concept of what constitutes nobility. I've talked about that kind of already. What makes a good king? What makes a noble leader? What makes a good soldier? All those kinds of questions. As you're reading this, you want to kind of be asking yourself that. What does the poem say about that? And because it's got two, maybe not two authors, but two scribes who are writing it, the poem itself can feel a little ambiguous at times, because both writers who are transcribing down, they made different errors in different sections, and so there's a sense that there's two perspectives, and they kind of get synthesized together. Now, they're not completely different. It's not like two people writing two completely different poems and it got mashed together. That's not what happened. It's just two different perspectives of the same story that was being written down, and that adds a level of ambiguity to the text that I think makes analyzing it that much more fun, because there's not really any super cut and dry answers. And so it's always fun to pick it apart because there's stuff to back up different interpretations of what's going on. Now, another one which kind of ties into the nobility thing is the concept of hospitality, and that's really important in this section. So Hrothgar is welcoming and generous to the people who come to stay with him, and Grendel, of course, represents an inversion of that. He steals and murders. He doesn't care about the laws of hospitality. He breaches the mead hall when everyone's sleeping. He kind of represents very much a betrayal of this kind of hospitality rules, and that's part of what makes him so monstrous. So a good example, think back to when we talked about the Odyssey. You've got sort of like Polyphemus the Cyclops, you've got the suitors. They represent sort of inversions of the hospitality customs, because Polyphemus starts eating the people who are staying with him and eating his food, and he has to be defeated. The suitors are taking advantage of Penelope's generosity, and they're being greedy, and they're just taking over. They're being violent. They're rude to beggars, and they have to be defeated in the end also. And then we've also got sort of good examples of hospitality, like Menelaus, when Telemachus goes to visit Menelaus, and he's welcoming and he's generous, and he gives him a place to stay, and he gives him food and everything. And then we've got the Phaeacians who welcome Odysseus in, and they give him treasure and they help him get home. And so we got two examples of sort of proper hospitality, and then we've got two examples of people who abuse those hospitality rules and who are evil because of it. And so this is something that we see in this. We've got, Hrothgar being a generous ruler, and then we've got Grendel, who exists as sort of a subversion of that generosity. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that. Next week, I'm going to be wrapping up September, and then the week after that, we're going back to Beowulf, and we'll be talking about Beowulf as he fights Grendel's mother. So I will see you then, and we'll continue this later. Bye.